When you hear that New Haven was one of the first towns in America to be built upon a grid system, it tells you a lot about the way the streets were set up, but it doesn't tell you a whole lot about the city. Who lived here? What kind of dwellings were in this area? Geographic Information Systems have been an integral part of municipal life for decades now, because they add crucial information back into our everyday geographies. Joining us today is John McKenzie of Flo-Analytics to discuss the uses of GIS, how it's evolved, and where the technology is going. We'd like to thank our premier sponsor, Digital Back Office Palo Alto Networks. Check them out at digitalbackoffice.com or paloaltonetworks.com, as well as our sponsors at Gateway and Houstonic Community Colleges. The Municipal Voice is the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast in collaboration with WNHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments. CCM's Municipal Voice podcast continues to present a key forum on important state-local issues. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the consensus views of CCM or our member municipal leaders. John, thanks for talking with us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So before we get into GIS, can you tell us a little bit about the company you work for, Flo-Analytics? What kind of businesses and organizations do you work with? What sort of services do you offer to them?
Sure, yeah. So we are a GIS and data analytics company, and we primarily work with local government at the city and town level, as well as with the state and to a lesser degree, federal government. We do a little bit of work with nonprofits and private businesses as well, but the majority of our work is for local governments. We do GIS services, but we also do really anything that is data or analysis related. Okay. That's really our area of focus, is helping people solve problems with data.
And where are you guys based out of?
Well, we are based out of, technically we have we have offices in Vancouver, Washington, Seattle, Washington, Boston, and Denver.
So all over.
We're kind of all over, yeah, especially now.
Yeah, and now you're based in your living room, I'm sure.
Right.
So I guess for the people at home that might not, follow this as closely, when you work with municipalities, it's primarily the GIS, right?
Correct.
And so could you tell people at home what GIS is?
Sure, yeah. So GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems. Some people like to say Geographic Information Science, just because it's more of a,
Sounds fancier, yeah.
It does, yeah. And it's a little bit more of a practice now than it is a single software. So, what it really is mapping, right? If you really boil it down. It's something that people use and cities and towns use to map things, to know their location in a very accurate level, and to be able to perform some analysis based upon location. So it's used in a lot of different ways. And I guess for the cities and towns, the most sort of traditional way of using GIS is looking at something like mapping your sewer lines or your water lines, maybe your street lights, so that if you have somebody who's got to go out and do some inspections, they know precisely where those things are. And
so there's something wrong with pole 293. Where's that? You can look at the map and say it's at the corner of such and such, and they go out and they fix it.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. And that's as well as managing your tax records, right, and parcels. Okay. So all of those are going to be linked to a sort of digital map that people can then manage all of the information related to those tax parcels using a GIS system. So that's a more of a really traditional way that cities and towns are using GIS, and sort of what most cities and towns experience with that is. It has been for quite a while.
Yeah, you say traditional, and I'm curious, just briefly, kind of what's the history of this? Because traditional computers, like say, it's gone from systems, and now it's more of a science. And so it sounds like it's something that's kind of evolving, kind of quickly as a discipline. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been around for a while. However, I would say in the last 10 years, with the movement of a lot of this information to the cloud has changed how it's accessed quite a bit, and its visibility within the general public at large. I think pretty much anybody who's looked at a computer over the last year has probably been looking at some GIS applications, but they may not even know it.
Okay.
And I guess what I mean by that is, a good example is that when you said we had, okay, here's a street light, 238, and you want to go out and see where that is. Well, 10, 15 years ago, maybe the person who was going to look at that street light and repair it was looking at a paper map, finding the address, and they're going there, right?
Yeah.
But now what they would do is you might have a mobile unit like your phone, and you'd pull up your map application with the asset on there. You would be able to see a point that showed you're at street light 238, and you could see, oh, the bulb is broken, right? So you click open a button, right? That would open a form and allow you to say 238 had a broken street light. I replaced it, and you record all this on your phone, right? I replaced street light 238, and I clicked send, and now it's back in your database. And so whoever's back in the office understands that, oh, this has been fixed in real time.
Yeah.
So that ability to access the information and transfer it back and forth in real time is something that is more recent and has sort of really opened up the opportunities for cities and towns to use GIS in lots of different areas.
Yeah. It sounds like it would be really useful for something like storm response, for instance, where you have a crew out and you want to be checking problems off the list in real time and know, all right, someone fixed that, we don't need to do that. And this is the next one that's closest, so this is the route you should go. I'm assuming it can do that sort of stuff too at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where the sort of the analytical aspect of GIS comes in. So anybody who has ever used navigation system, right? Your phone or, anything at all, that is GIS, right? Google Maps is, you put in your directions you want to get from point A to point B. That's GIS. That's you're getting your spatial analysis and telling you the best way to go. And sort of the example you were talking about, like storm response, a great example of that is like snowplow routes, right? That's very frequently used for, that type of service. You have a snowstorm, you need to plow the streets. What streets do you do first, right? Well, you might want to plow the routes that the school buses drive through first or something like that, right? So there are a lot of different factors that you can incorporate into your analysis and then, put those results on a map, put them in the hands of the person who is going to be needing that information to make the best decisions possible. And it's all right there. It can be done very quickly.
I know you've mentioned like mapping for tax purposes and repairs, tracking, plowing. What kind of other features are kind of most used in municipalities of GIS?
The waters and the water and sewer lines, that sort of is what it's very, very standard. What we're seeing now, though, is cities and towns starting to do a bit more with GIS and using it in ways that haven't been done previously. And that's sort of as the technology has evolved. Here, just throwing out an example here, everybody lately has seen the COVID-19 dashboards and maps of things like that. Well, those are all based in GIS. And so what we've seen is cities and towns using GIS to make information available to their public. So for instance, a lot of places have done where school lunches where there is, being provided when schools were closed down and people needed to be able to pick up the school lunches for their children. Those were all being done. That information was being promoted through GIS, so people would know where to go to access it. Additionally, testing sites, all of that information is being shown on testing sites. The state of Connecticut has a big COVID data portal, which is based all in GIS and has tons of different links about, with your maps showing how many residents in each city or town is tested positive. So there's really been this massive expansion of this online GIS ability to access all of this information related to the COVID-19 response.
Yeah. So if I get a text on my phone from the town government saying there's been a warning or some sort of news item like that, is that based on GIS too? Like they know that phone is with someone in that area and that's why they're sending it?
Potentially, yeah. So it's expanded so much, it's almost difficult to say. But the reality is, yeah, with GIS, you can very easily say who is in an area. That's one of the basic aspects of GIS is identifying where things are in any area. So fundamentally, that would be relying on GIS. A good example here is when say a city or town is doing construction and specific neighborhood, and they are then required to send out a notice to all of the folks within, a quarter-mile radius or something. That's very quickly, somebody would be going into the GIS system for the town, putting in the location of where the construction is taking place, essentially clicking out a button, which is going to then allow them to generate that list of all the parcels that need to be contacted. And then an email can be sent out, or perhaps it needs to be sent in a letter so they can print out their labels. It's all connected back to the GIS system. Which you can imagine before you had that, it was much more difficult because somebody's looking at a map and then they're looking at all the parcels and they're writing down the address and then they're writing out a label and printing. Now it's just, put where it's happening, where the construction's going on, press a button, print out my labels, or just shoot off an email. It's all in records. And so it's just happening much, much more quickly.
Yeah. What do you think is available right now, sort of features that are being underused, that could be taken more advantage of as they are right now that, kind of already there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the reason is what you mentioned before, that the technology has evolved so rapidly that one example is about, say 10 or 15 years ago, a lot of cities and towns were paying to have these sort of basic interactive web maps stood up on maybe their city or town's website. And those web maps would contain all of the data. And when we talk about data with GIS, we often refer to layers. So I may use that term. But they would have a map, and they may have a layer showing their tax parcels, a layer showing the sewer lines and the water lines. And there may be a layer showing the points where the schools are and things like that. Now, building something like that 10 years ago when cities first recognized the need for that, it was a pretty big undertaking in terms of getting the platform, the interactive platform stood up and managing all of the information and the layers that would be brought into making sure that there's metadata and that those things are being updated. Today, you can deploy something like that very quickly, right? However, there are still a lot of cities continuing to pay for these types of services, to pay for having this map that stood up and being managed, when in reality, it could be done, that type of thing can be done, within a matter of a few hours within using software that most cities and towns already have. So that's something that I think is, that could be taken advantage of quite a bit more by cities and towns that maybe aren't, simply because there's often not time to think about all of these things.
Yeah. Is it thinking about it, or is it having someone on staff that knows how to use some of these new tools, or working with a company that does that with them, I guess?
I would say it's kind of all three. And the reason being is that, what I've seen is GIS, it can be very hard to sort of describe narrowly, because it's not a narrow tool. It is really sort of ubiquitous across city and town management. And as a result, most cities, if you're a city, you've got maybe 10 to 30,000 people, you may have one or two GIS employees, and they probably started by working with public works or the engineering department. And there's so much that they can do there. They're overwhelmed just doing work for that specific department. And the technology has evolved so quickly. It can be very difficult for somebody who's, working 40 or 50 hours a week just to maintain what they've got in their GIS data to then keep up with all of these new features that are coming out. I live and breathe.
Keeping up is a full-time job,
exactly.
for you at least, right?
Right. Yeah. And so when you're working for public works or engineering or something, and you are maintaining all of your GIS systems that need to operate, because you can't, like I said, it's the baseline, it's fundamental. You need to have that data for sewer and water lines. And then when are you going to have the time to realize that, all of this stuff has changed in 10 years. GIS information has changed rapidly. The technology can be accessed. You would never really know that, oh, you know what? You could also be managing your cemetery. If you have a municipal cemetery, that pretty quickly these days deploy a cemetery application that are traditionally in paper records. And then you can put that out to your public. So when people are going to visit their cemetery, instead of going to town hall to get a paper map or try to figure out where their relatives may be, they're able to quickly go on their phone, do a little search, and they'll tell, and a cemetery site would be, right there available. And so, like, if you're working in public works, you're not going to know that. And if you're a city and town, you probably have 2 people in GIS, and they're probably doing those things that you absolutely need them to do. Working in those areas. So that's made it really difficult for cities and towns to sort of have that extra capacity to do the things that are new and that will really improve the efficiency of your operations, but maybe aren't required to just keep your city running.
Like if it isn't ain't broke, don't fix it sort of mentality. But if you can find the way to invest that time in it, it could probably save them time in the long run because of these more efficient systems.
Absolutely. It saves a ton of time. And GIS is one of these things that it's a blessing and a curse. When a city starts using GIS, it sells itself immediately because there are so many different applications. However, when you have just 1 or 2 people doing it, there's so much that they can do in one area that they never have any time. And what we see a lot is that once a department, once again, it almost always starts with public works, because managing the sewer lines and the water lines really need to be done. So once somebody comes in, a city starts using GIS, and they see that there's all this value, and then maybe the planning team comes in, and they see, oh, I could do this, or maybe there's like the parks, and like, can you map my parks, and maybe map where we have different facilities at the parks. And it's very easy for city GIS folks to get overwhelmed very quickly because they are, it's visual, right? It's visual information. So everybody sees the results of what they're doing. And so everybody wants their time. They only have so much time. Most cities, like I said, if you're a city between 10,000, 30,000 people, you've probably got one or two GIS folks. And every department in that city or town wants them to do something. And it becomes very difficult to have the capacity to do everything, something for everybody, really.
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH 103.5 FM.
What are some other departments that can be using GIS that we might not have thought of? Like, is there an application in social services, like mapping where people are in need of things, or what kind of other that we wouldn't have thought of?
Yeah, well, so that was a good example of social services where people are in need of things. And I just want to highlight an example because it was very interesting. We did an office hours program last week for anybody in Connecticut working in GIS, where we got one of our resident GIS nerds on the phone. So just call in and talk and ask questions just as a way to brainstorm. And we got a phone call from a person working for the Department of, I forget the exact department, is within emergency services for the state of Connecticut. And they had been tasked with looking to create a visual map-based platform and dashboard to help the state identify where people who are currently quarantined, but for having been exposed to COVID, not necessarily tested positive, but exposed and so required to quarantine. And they need to have things like medication delivered. So say they're diabetic and they're going to need to get that. Well, the state wanted to be able to have an easy way for them to understand, well, who are those people? Where are they? And what types of medication they need. And so they reached out to somebody in the emergency management department who doing GIS to come up with this. And so she called into our office hours just to do some brainstorming. And that was, I mean, I think that's a great example of the social services aspect of managing, what people need, where they need it, and when they need it.
Yeah.
If there wasn't the location aspect, all of that information can be very easily managed in any traditional database. But you need that location aspect because that, the people who would be getting that medication maybe need to know the closest pharmacy. There's a lot of other information about the spatial component of where people are that needs to be factored in. Anytime that information needs to be managed, it's going to be brought into GIS. So yeah, social services, I mentioned parks and recreation are using that all the time. Another emergency response, as we said, there's a lot of cemetery management is something that come up. I don't know what department that actually falls into within a city, but municipal cemeteries is something that we've seen there's been a huge demand for because it's very difficult for cities to manage all of that information. And GIS is being used there.
I mean, listening to what you're talking about, how it's sort of changed in the past decade, it sounds like the start of GIS, it was a lot of sort of bringing information that was in sort of the legacy analog world into the digital world, getting the maps in and the map of the other thing and combining those two. And it sounds like now that a lot of that is sort of done, that the focus is shifting more towards how to use that information together, different pieces of information together and get it to the people and like the way you use it rather than just having access to it.
Right. And I think that's a really good point. And pushing the information out there and trying to promote transparency is GIS is a very useful way to do that. And it's something that more and more people in the general public really want, right? Everybody has access to information now, and there's a demand for that information, and that's increasingly seen with public entities, local governments. And so GIS is frequently used to help get that information out there in terms of where things are. And with GIS software these days, you can build these open data portals, which is where you just put all sorts of information and you actually ingest information, right? So with these open data portals, you're putting up the information that you have, all the public records you've created at the city or town, and you're putting them in a location that's easily searchable and can be accessed by anyone. But then you also are able to bring in data that maybe comes from the state. So there may be aerial imagery from that the state has, and those can come to your own, public-facing platform that people can easily access. Another area that you're seeing it being used more and more within local governments, which is in response to public health, because you can map areas of cities that are vulnerable to COVID-19. We helped in Connecticut create a map and a dashboard that took in information about populations based on census data, as well as other aspects that had things like, in census block groups, you can find information about the rates of diabetes, or the rates of people with high cholesterol, the rates of people who are exposed to poor air quality. You can put all of that information on a map, identify the areas that people are going to be more susceptible to severe illness from COVID-19. And you can make sure that your services you're providing as a local health department in your city are focused in those areas.
Have the resources available where you're going to need them.
Right, exactly. Helping you to prioritize and once again, making things more efficient, which is a general theme with GIS and local governments. You can always find a way to make something more efficient by using GIS.
Something we haven't talked about. Is there applications for this with environmental studies and stuff, or like,
Oh,
we
yeah.
talked about tracking a disease. Is there a potential for tracking a potential spill or some sort of environmental thing? What's going on with that
Sure.
sort of stuff?
Oh, well, it's funny you say spill. So I will give you my introduction to GIS was that I studied environmental science and policy in graduate school at University in Worcester, Massachusetts. And I was studying brownfields and things like that. But I started using GIS. I had taken some GIS courses and started using it to sort of inform the work I was doing. And I just fell in love with the software and the tools because it allowed me to answer so many questions. Anyway, I finished grad school. It was 2010, and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill had just taken place. There was a company in Cambridge, Massachusetts that was working on what's called the Natural Resource Damage Assessment for the oil spill under contract to NOAA. And because I had a GIS background, they were looking for people to come in and help. And so I jumped in and started working, helping them to, map that oil spill, where the spill was in the Gulf, the extent of the spill, where there were species that had been affected by the spill, mapping mortality of different species based upon how much exposure and where that exposure was to the oil. And quite frankly, environmental applications is really how GIS in the modern age started. The company that is the company for GIS in terms of having the most prevalent software that everybody uses, it's called ESRI, which stands for Environmental Research Systems Institute, maybe. Everybody just calls them ESRI now, but it's based in environment, right? And when you talk to people in cities or towns, or almost anybody doing GIS, the running joke is that we all started doing it because we were interested in environmental issues. And then the tool, and that it's such a fundamental tool to addressing environmental problems, environmental issues, that if you start doing GIS, you're usually using in environmental applications. Soil types, you can map spills, you can recently out in the West with the fires and fire hazards, there's a lot of mapping related to that.
Would this tie into like flood zones and those sort of things?
Oh yeah. So FEMA flood zone maps are a
GIS sort of thing.
It's a GIS thing. One, they're provided to you in a map format, a GIS format, but they're also, calculated using GIS, right? So you're looking at the topography of the area, as well as information about tides and all of that. You're putting together a spatial analysis to figure out what areas during certain types of storm or during certain types of a tide are going to get inundated based upon your GIS analysis.
So they warn, like, the storm surge coming, this particular town or place needs to get out of there. It's because, in part, GIS crunched the numbers of the tide and this, whatever it said, this neighborhood is probably going to get hit. Right.
And then another thing that happens more and more often now, and this is a very more recent application of GIS, is after a storm has hit and assessing damage, right? A lot of these places aren't safe to go into. Well, now people fly drones that capture aerial imagery, and that the drone comes back, that aerial imagery is loaded into a GIS system. The GIS software is going to produce a highly accurate three-dimensional model of the area that has been affected, so that the people who are responding to the incident have a clear picture of what they're getting into, right? So it's, and that's something I probably should have mentioned earlier with the evolution of GIS, is that the use of drones and being able to capture aerial three-dimensional imagery that you can then analyze in a GIS system has been hugely beneficial in a lot of different applications. Pretty much any area we've talked about, emergency response, but also land use planning, development, things like that. You're getting a lot of that information by being able to create these three-dimensional models of areas that are difficult to access, and that you can fly a drone up for a much lower cost than trying to go up and grab some of this information with through a plane or something like that.
How will the census that we're just finishing right now impact the use of GIS over the next year or so as the Census Bureau releases its 2020 data?
Well, yeah. So the census data and GIS the census, every piece of census data will end up in a GIS format, right?
Yeah.
They provide the tables, but they are also going to provide shape files and other types of GIS data that can be brought into the system. And all of that is going to be put into maps. So any census data that's out there, you're going to be able to access in a map format, because quite frankly, that's what most people want to see, right? Where's the population highest, you're going to look at a map, right?
Yeah.
The other aspect is for redistricting. So both for legislative redistricting and local redistricting, the analysis that will be used to create the new districts that result from that information coming from the census, that will all be done through a GIS analysis. Right? Apportionment of the population into the appropriate districts will be done by that GIS analysis. I'm just going to talk about gerrymandering.
Yeah, I was saying that seemed, I know it's been a topic that's been rising in recent years of this sort of extreme gerrymandering. And it seems like, yeah, GIS has sort of been the technology that has enabled people to kind of focus in on down to the neighborhood. Like, we want this neighborhood, but not this one next to it. And GIS kind of is the genie that came out of the bottle for that one.
Well, I would like to think that GIS is also the tool that will help stop it.
Okay.
Sure, it because it is powerful and you can figure out that information. It does allow people to do things like that.
It is a powerful tool that could be used for
good or evil.
Yes.
So fortunately, a lot of states and a lot of places have started to put in more regulations to prevent gerrymandering, or have altered their laws, that mandate how the redistricting is done to prevent gerrymandering. So it's the way that not only does it allow you to do gerrymandering, but it's also the tool that allows you to tell if something is gerrymandering, right?
So you can pick the exact people you want to vote for you, or if legislatures pass rules to make things need to be more fair, they could use GIS to make sure that a district was a representative sample more. They could be like, okay, is this truly representative of the greater population?
Exactly.
It's the flip side of that. You can pick it to be as specific as you want, or you could pick it to be as general as you want. Like, we want the most representative population, not the one cherry picked for one side or the other.
Correct. And the Federal Voting Rights Act is written so that you can't be discriminating through your boundary drawing of particular, ethnic minority populations, whether it's intentional or unintentional, right? It doesn't matter. And GIS is used to determine whether it's happening either way, right? So, and in a lot of those cases where it's unintentional, the folks who would have done it would have no idea without GIS, right? It's only because they have GIS that they can say, oh, we've unintentionally created a line or a division within a district that is not going to be fair to a certain group of people. And so with GIS, they're allowed to correct that and make sure it's not happening. Additionally, there's, so in addition to, you hear a lot about legislative redistricting, right? You hear about that because it's, you're electing representation, you're congressional representatives, folks, the senators, as well as on the, more local side, you might be electing state senators and things like that. In a lot of places, though, it's not just those groups that have to redistrict, right? If you are any sort of government body that elects your representation based upon a geographic area. So if you're a city or town and you elect your, your select person based upon a ward within your city or a neighborhood within your city. Those groups are required to redistrict too. And the redistricting process there is a little bit different than when you're talking about representing your, state and federal representation. It's important for groups. A lot of times we found that those organizations don't even know that they're required to redistrict.
Okay.
There's so much information out there about the legislative redistricting that other side sort of just is forgotten about. But it's an important thing for those types of organizations, cities and towns, and in other parts of the country, there are a lot of districts that sort of operate outside of the city or town structure, that they are all required to do this redistricting after the census, so that there's that fair representation. And the general rule is that you're trying to get these districts the same size in population to the degree that's feasible.
Yeah.
And that feasibility is determined by a whole lot of other regulations that have to be, enacted too. Like you can't violate the Federal Voting Rights Act, and that you're typically encouraged to create boundaries that keep groups that have municipal or mutual interest. You're typically required to keep those together. So there's a lot of different factors at play that make it not as easy as just saying each district has the exact same population.
Yeah.
The point of redistricting is that, over 10 years, population has changed, and some areas have grown and other areas have shrunk in terms of population. And so you redistrict so that you can apportion those and make those as representative or as fair as possible in terms of the numbers. And then there are all the other factors you need to consider too, to make sure that just, making the numbers even doesn't make it unfair in other aspects.
Yeah. Well, Flo-Analytics works with CCM on a GIS consortium.
Yes.
How did that come about?
Well, so that came about, I think I mentioned at the start of this call that we have offices in Vancouver, Washington, and Seattle. We also have offices in Portland, Oregon. So about, 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, the Association of Washington Cities, which is essentially the CCM of Washington.
Or equivalent out there, yep.
Yeah, they noticed that there were some cities were facing a lot of the same challenges with GIS that I had mentioned, in that they were realizing there are all these other applications to it, and the technology is evolving, and it's hard for their city staff. Their city staff are overwhelmed, and it's hard for them to keep up. So they, through a previous relationship with Flo-Analytics, got together and said, we have this structure in place to provide these pooled services for things like healthcare to municipal employees, drug and alcohol testing for municipal employees, to do a lot of these services that cities individually would face a much higher expense on the open market.
Yeah.
So when they pool together, they can purchase those services at better rates. And so they started thinking, I wonder if the same thing could be done with GIS. And so Flo got together with AWC and figured out a program where they were able to provide, to sort of take a look at all the cities in Washington, which there are 281, and look at that as a market rather than, say, a city that's in eastern Washington, which is a more rural area that has maybe a population of 500 people that would never on their own be able to have any GIS, right?
Yeah.
It's very rural. They just don't have the capacity or the resources to implement it, or if they have, to do anything else other than the very basic bare minimum that you need to get by. And so they're able to create a program that was really successful in getting a lot of cities in Washington to start doing more with GIS and help basically govern better and provide better services to the residents. So at one of the sharing conferences that the state associations and state leagues and things have, AWC talked about this this program and how it's been great for their members. And so CCM heard about this program and reached out to Flo-Analytics to learn more. And at the time we had opened up our Boston office. So we started talking about, well, let's see if, it makes sense to do something like this in Connecticut.
Yeah.
So what we did from Flo-Analytics side is we took a look and said, well, is this going to make sense for us as a contractor to do this? And for CCM, is it going to make sense for them to do this for their members? So we took a look at, the types of cities that were using our services in Washington and the types of cities that are in Connecticut and where they are with GIS. We put out a survey. We held a focus group. We did some GIS analysis, really, to see where they were. And it was funny because Connecticut and Washington, they're on other sides of the country, right? They're very different in that Washington state is fairly large and kind of spread out outside of the Seattle area. And Connecticut is much more compact. But the size of the cities were almost right in line. It was almost like a mirror image of one another. And if you're looking at the cities specifically.
In terms of population or?
Yeah, they had, in terms of cities that were, like I said, I've said the number 10,000, 30,000 before. And that's because in Washington, that's what we saw as the cities that were benefiting most from the GIS consortium because they're at that place where they had maybe one or two internal GIS staff who were really overwhelmed. And Connecticut and Washington had, I think it may have been the exact same number of cities within that population range. And then it was the same thing for the cities that are a little bit higher, that 30 to like 60,000, and Connecticut had like the same number there. So it was really right in line. And in terms of having that GIS staff of 1 to 2, the two states had very similar, very similar profiles in terms of where they were.
So you were confident you could replicate the success you had out there here.
Yeah, if we were going to replicate it anywhere, it was just like, wow, Connecticut makes a lot of sense. And quite frankly, it also had some benefits because COGs are really active in and they've done a lot with GIS. So it was in Washington, there are parts of rural Washington where they don't even have some of the base information. And so that it's really, if you don't have that, it's difficult to do anything with GIS because getting started is always the hardest part. In Connecticut, a lot of these cities have that base, right? So they're really in a better place to take off. So the more we looked at it, the more Connecticut made sense for this type of program.
Yeah. You mentioned the COGS here. Is this county-based in a lot of other states?
It is, yes.
Okay.
Particularly the things like tax parcels, as well as aerial imagery, which is the high resolution satellite data, right? Or it's not really, a lot of times it's what's called LiDAR. LiDAR is high resolution data that gives you information about your land and your land cover, really.
It's the laser shows you the topography, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they have to fly planes to do that, right? With a big machine that's shooting down lasers, essentially, in order to collect this information. It's very expensive. And so it's typically not something that, a city or town wouldn't individually fly have a LiDAR flight. It would just be way too cost prohibitive. So, encourage that groups of or regional areas get together in order to do this stuff. And I know that's been done in Connecticut, and I know there's interest in doing it again because topography changes over time, right? Your land cover changes. So it's important to be able to do these things periodically, but it can be challenging just because you typically need you need that regional effort.
Yeah. So sounds like, you saw the success out west replicating out here. Where do you see, the consortium and also just kind of the unity of GIS and local government going in the future?
Well, I think the biggest thing is helping cities and towns take that next step so that it's not just people managing, land records or their utilities, but allowing them to apply some different applications that maybe the departments that haven't always been able to access GIS because your 1 or 2 GIS staff are just focused in public works, allowing them to take advantage of those resources too. I think back to a situation in Washington that we encountered where there was a suburb outside of Seattle is expanding rapidly. Their population had gone from like 30,000 to 60,000 in about 5 years.
Okay.
And there was building going up everywhere. And the citizens and the residents kept coming into their town meetings and saying, like, what is this building for? We see all these buildings going up. We have no idea what's going on. And, so like the city might go out and put up a sign, and, you can't see it, you can't read it, you're in your car. You don't really want people to be staring at the sign, reading it when they're in their car. So nobody knew what was going on. They just knew there was a ton of development going on where they lived, and they just wanted to know, like, what's going on? Why is it going up? Where, how long is it going to take? So they hired us through the GIS consortium in Washington to come in and look at their building permit system and link it up to an interactive web-based map that they were able to put on their website, so that anytime there was development coming up, the building inspector, whoever is filling out the building permit, would type it into their computer, and then it would appear instantaneously without that person entering the building permit database having to do anything. It would appear on the map on the city website that would allow them, the public, to see, hey, this just turned red, which means it's this type of development. And if I click, I can see when the public meeting is about this development. I can go and provide my comment, and I can see, who is the planner who's overseeing this effort. And so it just gave that access to a specific situation that the residents in that town were concerned about. It was able to integrate information from one department, bring it to another department, and put it out to the public in a way that they were able to quickly access and understand the information. And as a result, at these public meetings, they were able to address things other than just, hey, what's this building on this street going up, right? Because it's like, it's all on our website now. And people would go to the website, and that website's still up, and it's that map is still there, and people are still going there, looking at this information.
Great. So, they can come into the conversation with, information.
Right. And so an application like that is something that city, they had the exact same situation, right? They had 2 GIS staff, and there was no way they were ever going to have time to do something like that, even though there was a big public demand for it. The public demand wasn't maybe for mapping their sewer systems and their water systems and making sure that things have been inspected in time, but they really needed to make sure that was happening, right? So they never would have been able to meet that public demand. They weren't going to be able to hire a new GIS, a new staff member, right? That's very expensive. But they were able to use this consortium to get better rates in order to tackle a big, an important challenge that they were facing in a much more efficient manner that without it, they probably would have just had to ignore. So I hope that that's what we can do in Connecticut. There are these challenges. I've mentioned the cemeteries before because we hear it over and over again. It's not something we ever expected to really work on. But we had cities come to us and say, the folks in our town hall are spending all of this time helping, people come and find their relatives in cemeteries. And they spend this time doing it because it's a sentimental thing, right? They don't want to say like, oh, sorry, I can't help you.
Yeah.
Right? They want to go out. But like, they really shouldn't be walking through cemeteries with, residents and, showing them it's just not something they've, the town has the time to do. Yeah. And so we kept getting these questions asking, can we build something to help do this? And I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, it's a spatial problem, right? It's knowing where, a relative is buried. And so we're able to go in and pull together these applications that allow, that can then be put on a city's website. So it's like, here's your tab for the municipal cemetery, and they can click on it and they can pull it up on their phone and they can quickly see, oh, here we go. And this is where, our relative is buried, and they can go there without having to go to the town hall and ask to be walked through the cemetery and using up somebody's time. So projects like that, there are maybe those things that you provide a ton of benefit. The ability for the GIS consortium to provide a path for cities and towns do those sorts of things. That's what I hope to see. Yeah. What I hope it evolves to. And then one more thing that I really want to mention, because we've done a lot of this, is one of the biggest things we see with cities and towns, because of that challenge that the technology has changed so fast, A lot of times, cities and towns using GIS don't know what they don't know, right? They don't know what else the other options are, or even if they do, they don't necessarily know how do we get there in a manner that fits within our budget. So one of the benefits to the GIS consortium is the ability for us to come in and sort of create that path. So if a city's like, hey, we want to be doing this and this and this with GIS in 5 years, but it looks like it's going to cost us, $100,000 that we don't have to do it. We're able to come in and say, well, maybe that's not the case, or maybe it is the case. But we're able to come in and help provide a path and take into account, like, okay, this is what your budget is. This is where you want to go. These are the steps that you can take to get there and to get the services and that you need. This is the path forward. So a lot of times it's just providing that map, because once again, if you have GIS employees just focused on keeping up their own systems, it's very difficult for them to figure out, how do you take the next step, because all their time is being spent managing what they've already got.
Well, great. John with Flo-Analytics, thanks so much for talking with us today.
Oh, thank you, Matt. I appreciate the opportunity. And thanks for having us. This is great.
We'd like to thank our guest, John McKenzie of Flo-Analytics. Thanks to our sponsors, Digital Back Office, Palo Alto Networks, who you can check out at digitalbackoffice.com and paloaltonetworks.com, and Gateway Community College and Housatonic Community College. Learn more at gatewayct.edu and housatonic.edu. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM and WNHH, 103.5 FM. Kevin Maloney is our executive producer, Christopher Gilson is our producer, Harry Draws is on the boards, and I'm Matt Ford, your host. Be sure to check out our Facebook page and give us a like, and watch out for our CCM chat series on our YouTube page.